Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer admitted this about past decisions made regarding COVID lockdowns. I guess hindsight is quite literally 2020. Let's take a listen.
Michigan would have been manufacturing the world's masks and swabs and would have helped keep people safe.
But I mean in terms of lockdown.
In terms of, there were moments where we, had to make some decisions that in retrospect don't make a lot of sense, right? If you went into the hardware store, you could go in the hardware store, but we didn't want people, all congregating around the gardening supplies. People said, oh, she's outlawed seeds. It was February in Michigan. No one was planting anyway. But that being said, some of those policies, I look back and think, that what maybe was a little more than we needed to do.
So, Robbie, is this something to celebrate?
Well, look, it's nice to hear any government official who was responsible for these policies admit that they were wrong. Michigan's, yes, their policies around like home and garden supply buying were, I know that sounds very specific, but they were especially egregious, and like you could go to one store and do this, you couldn't go to this other store. It was so arbitrary, as she's admitting there, what was locked down and what wasn't. Yes, fine. At the very beginning, Michigan was not unique in that regard. There were policies that didn't make sense anywhere. No one was going to the beaches in Michigan at the time. It was very cold. I'm from Michigan. Very cold there in the winter. But in other places, right, you had a policy that, right, they closed beaches, they closed parks, et cetera. Now we know you should have let people, and honestly, we knew pretty early on there was no public health rationale for doing that. In fact, it was negative for public health because you were driving people crazy by keeping them cooped up all day inside when they would have been perfectly happy
and healthier
outside. That's not the only very bad COVID rules enacted in Michigan. The same nursing home policies that were in place in New York that partly doomed Andrew Cuomo. I mean, he was actually resigned over the sexual misconduct stuff, but he should have resigned and maybe faced more than just resigning over the policy of putting sick COVID patients back in nursing homes. There are a lot of questions about whether the exact same policies were in practice in Michigan. This is very personal for me. I lost someone, elderly woman who took care of me when I was a kid. She died in a nursing home, got COVID right at the very beginning. It sounds like, I don't know for sure. It seems like that could have been the result of very similar policies.
Yeah.
And that was wrong-headed. And she's never really faced the level of investigations that Cuomo got. Again, I'm not saying it was exactly the same, but there was enough there to look into it. So I hope that day of reckoning comes.
So what do you think? I mean, obviously, I think it's a good thing for folks to be openly discussing mistakes that were made during the COVID era. I don't see it as beneficial for people to feel so afraid of backlash that they won't even acknowledge that they've done things that are wrong. However, is that enough? Are these kind of little admissions that are sneaking out here and there enough, or do we want to see a more robust reckoning in some way? We saw, for example, in New York, the people who had been fired as a consequence of not getting the vaccine had financial recompense made to them. Do you think there's other kinds of policies that we should be looking toward to make people whole for having suffered in ways under the pandemic, or should public officials be facing more scrutiny and perhaps electoral challenges as a consequence of making these bad decisions?
Yeah, I mean, electoral consequences are the correct way to hold public officials accountable. If you're supposed to not agree with their decisions.
Not prosecuting Fauci.
Well, right. As I said in that remark, I don't think he should be prosecuted over having given advice I disagree with. Now, maybe he should be looked at being held for some criminal matter if indeed he lied to Congress, or indeed some of the funding that he was responsible for caused the pandemic. That's an open question still. Someone like Whitmer, yeah, you would have hoped she would have faced a serious re-election challenge. She did. She was just re-elected in the midterms that were very favorable for Biden. Her Republican opponent, I think, unfortunately, was too far right for the state. The state, it's a swing state. It's a state that had a Republican governor for 8 years before Gretchen Whitmer, a very kind of moderate, non-Trumpy Republican. It's a state that went for Trump the first time and then flipped back to Democrats afterward. It's a state that Republicans can win in if they run the right kind of candidate. And I think a candidate who thoughtfully responded to some of Whitmer's policies that didn't make any sense, in addition to all sorts of other things, would have been well poised to actually defeat her. But again, it was a very pro-Trump kind of flirting with election denial type candidate who lost. And that's the reality, is that you're going to be governed in some of these states by one party if the other party is not speaking to voters' needs, and then also eschewing the kind of thing that voters just have no appetite for.
Yeah, I mean, I was reflecting on that famous image of the guy who dressed up as the Grim Reaper and was stalking the beach, kind of shaming people out of doing an activity.
Chasing people off beaches.
It was one of the healthiest activities that you can engage
And he was written about favorably in the mainstream media. They were in love with this guy.
And I was just reflecting on that moment in time. And
it was pretty crazy.
Yeah, and how, in some ways, I think, while it was inappropriate, I think a lot of people saw it as inappropriate at the time. Others who might only in retrospect look back and see it as goofy as it really was, did so because of the really high level of fear that people were living under back then. And that's not an excuse, but I'm just reflecting on why it is that people like Gretchen Whitmer are now willing to come out and make some of these admissions. It's because the fear level has gone down, rightly or wrongly. I mean, I think rightly, although I think there's some concerns about long COVID that aren't sufficiently
Gretchen Whitmer, I believe, also deserves criticism for how she framed this entire kidnapping plot that she was supposedly a victim of. Look, there was no plot. It was very much the FBI understood the whole time what was going on, and in fact paid and goaded the operatives to go along with. I mean, this is what I know. A lot of kind of right-wing people now think this is true of like everything that happens. So everyone's a paid FBI informant. It was an inside job. This is not a conspiracy. It genuinely was the case with this operation, that every part of it was understood and fully being monitored by the FBI. She was in no actual danger. In fact, they wanted the plot to move forward to a point so that they could prosecute these people who were just kind of upset right-wing people who were venting in a Facebook group. The fact that it got more involved than that is really on law enforcement. Yeah, I mean, it's just the only thing I was going to say about the Gretchen Whitmer thing and the kind of different climate of fear that we used to live under but now live under much less, is that I wonder, is there a kind of a good faith explanation for it? People were panicked and making silly decisions because, it wasn't clear what the threat level was in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic emerging. But also, is part of the pivot having to do with people's longer term political prospects? We saw Kathy Hochul make a real conservative pivot both on crime issues and on COVID issues, promulgating advice about how you can wear your mask under your chin on a subway and it's fine, in a way that made nobody happy and angered everyone. And Gretchen Whitmer is a governor from a Midwestern swing state who has desirable demographics in a kind of Democratic field where they're a little bit short on viable female candidates. And there's conversations about whether or not Biden's going to try to get rid of Kamala. And I wonder if there's a broader understanding that pivoting to a somewhat more common sense position on some of these COVID issues is a good political maneuver to I think that was clearly the message Democrats got a year plus ago when Youngkin won in Virginia, and there were a couple other very negative signs for Democrats. I think Democratic pollsters maybe got the message that we need our candidates to show at least a little bit of humility on this COVID stuff, to ease up on the brakes or step on the gas or whatever the right metaphor is here, to get past the COVID militant lockdown, or voters are just going to punish us to the end of times for it. So they did do that, and then they were able to not only stave off total defeat in the midterms, but actually have a very successful midterm. So that's my analysis of that little situation going on in my beloved former home state.
Local boy reports good.
More Rising right after this.